Finally, Boris Johnson has resigned as Prime Minister. And to be honest, I'm quite surprised it took this long. After the number of scandals he's had.
I thought he just stepped down as party leader.
Well, he said he's going to resign as Prime Minister.
Oh, okay. So
but he has stepped down as party leader.
So he's resigned as party leader, but then Prime Minister will come.
Yes. Yeah.
That's how it works.
Not necessarily, John. Anyway.
But anyway, he's been hit by so many scandals that it normally would have spelled the end for most other prime ministers. I think that everyone can recognise that, even the most fervent of Boris supporters. So what we're going to be talking about today is what actually brought him down, the mountain of scandals that did eventually bring him down. I'm going to summarise those, not go into too much detail, but then talk about his legacy, what he's actually done. And we're going to have a proper evaluation of the prime ministerialship of Alexander de Pfeffel Johnson.
I can never say that full name.
Pfeffel.
Was it Greek or something?
I think so, yeah.
No.
It's impossible to say. I can see why he calls himself Boris Johnson. So yes, moving on to the scandals. One of the most prominent in most people's mind is Partygate, which basically boils down to the fact he held parties in Downing Street, or his offices, including his own office, that violated his own COVID rules. And there were reports of things such as members of his cabinet coming back with suitcases full of booze, staff vomiting in the offices. It sounds like a wild night. And although I didn't really care about this as much as most people, because the fact they undermined their own rules just goes to show how bad the rules were in the first place. And Boris seemingly denied that the party broke, or that he was aware that his parties broke his own rules, despite the fact that everyone in the country obviously knew that you shouldn't be throwing parties when you're meant to be locked down, all that nonsense that we've since forgotten about. Of course, he and many of the attendees were fined by the police, and he was forced to apologise to the Queen on the eve of her husband, Prince Philip's funeral. And this is particularly important because at the actual funeral itself, she was seated alone at the funeral because mixing indoors was banned. And this was kind of a heartbreaking moment where you see the Queen alone at her husband's funeral, right in the midst of Boris Johnson having thrown parties. And it was a real clash of integrity, really, wasn't it? Because you've got Boris Johnson on the one hand making the rules and breaking them, then you've got the Queen being stoic, seated alone at the death of her husband. And it's really kind of sad, and people felt like this really reflected badly on Boris. It's not just the breaking the rules, but the timing as well of it was appalling.
Well, it's the understanding of what a leader is. I mean, Her Majesty understands that she has a duty and then does that duty, whereas
absolutely
the politicians don't.
Mm-hmm. And then there's lots of cases of sexual misconduct of Conservative MPs. I don't think there's a single time in British political history where a party has been so rife with these sexual misconduct cases and allegations. I know it's kind of par for the course for politics, but even so, just the frequency of them. So, for example, there were 2 by-elections after 2 MPs stepped down for separate cases of sexual misconduct, which resulted in both of them losing their seats. Obviously doesn't look good for Boris. There's obviously the Conservative lawmaker Imran Ahmed Khan resigning after being found guilty of having sexually abused a 15-year-old boy, which is appalling. Neil Parish, another Conservative lawmaker, I believe he represented Honiton in Devon, my home county, embarrassing, resigned after admitting he watched pornography on his phone in the House of Commons twice in a moment of madness. But how can it be a moment of madness if you do it twice? Seems a bit weird.
You can be twice mad. So.
But it was just a moment of madness, but it did happen twice. Very strange. Another Conservative lawmaker has been arrested on suspicion of rape, sexual assault and other offences, and they were bailed in May, and they have not been identified to protect the identity of the victim, so we don't even know who this person is. And yeah, that's a lot, isn't it? That's far too many, and especially in the short time that Boris has been Prime Minister, about 3 years-ish, isn't it? Something like that. And of course...
But I mean, these aren't the issues that I think anyone really cares about. I mean, no one cares that Prime Minister X got in X scandal that's, some sexual thing or whatever. They care about what they do as Prime Minister, what you actually achieve. And the things you care about with Boris Johnson is that he didn't achieve what you wanted him to.
Yes, and we will be getting on to that. But I feel like the the build-up of all of these scandals just ruined his credibility as someone who has integrity. As you alluded to earlier, someone who is a leader.
Maybe, but it's not really what matters when it comes down to, why was he elected and got all this support? Okay, well then he's at that position, he's got all this country behind him, and then manages to alienate every single one of them by not doing something useful for them. I mean, that's all you really have to do in politics, just keep your base happy.
I do think that plenty of the scandals did influence public opinion against him. People who don't follow politics so closely, they're more interested in the sort of interpersonal deeds to gather an idea of the moral character, because they can't understand the intricacies of the political policy. It takes a lot of understanding to do that, really, doesn't it?
Well, it's usually the opposite, in my opinion.
Oh, really?
It's like weird stuff happens in Westminster I don't care about. I care about, has he given a great speech that tells BLM to go F it or whatever, something like that, rather seems to get through to people at the...
Yeah, but we cover politics every day. We know what's going on. But to the average person sat at home...
This is an opinion debate.
But anyway, moving on, there was also the Owen Paterson affair, where a Parliamentary Standards Committee recommended suspending a Conservative lawmaker, former Minister Owen Paterson, for 30 days after finding he had committed an egregious case of paid advocacy by lobbying on behalf of companies that paid him. And that isn't necessarily the part that reflects badly on Boris. It's that the Conservatives initially voted to halt the suspension and tried to overhaul the process of investigating lawmakers for doing this sort of thing, which is obviously inherently corrupt. He got given money to lobby on behalf of a company and did so. So that's an egregious case of paid advocacy, as the committee suggested, I would say. And yes, eventually he resigned and the government had to abandon this, but it looked really bad because they were covering for him for something that is clearly wrong. Like, someone should be held accountable for doing that. That's clear corruption. And they also lost the election to replace Paterson, so that was lost to another party. So you're seeing they're just trickling away these seats, and it doesn't look good for Boris. And the penultimate one is the Downing Street Flatgate, which was probably one of the more minor ones. To be fair, basically, there was a refurbishment of Boris's Downing Street flat, which led to him being fined £1,700 and for apparently failing to report that it was funded by a donation. I mean, I don't really care about that. If they're using donations to refurbish flats in Downing Street, it's not really a big deal, is it? But for some reason, people seem to care about that one.
Well, the argument is, what did he get in return for that donation?
Yes, of course.
That would be a case of corruption.
But I think because he was pretty transparent about it, he just said, okay, this, and this happened. They looked into it. There was no intentional misleading or trying to hide stuff. He just seemed to think it was fine, which I can kind of see a little bit more so than some of the other stuff. But the final straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, was known as the Pincher affair. And the Scotsman has actually got quite a good article breaking down how this gradually led to the collapse of Boris Johnson's government. And I'm going to read a little bit from this. So it's titled, "Why is Boris Johnson Resigning? Timeline of events that led to Prime Minister Boris Johnson standing down." So the story starts off on the 29th of June 2022, when Mr. Pincher allegedly behaved inappropriately while drunk on Wednesday night at a Carlton club, which was a Conservative private members club in London. And he eventually resigned because of how he behaved. I'm not entirely sure what he got up to cause him to resign. But he resigned as Deputy Chief Whip, and apparently The Sun reported the allegations against him the evening before. So it started to become a national story. The Prime Minister bowed to pressure in the face of an outcry over his delay in suspending the whip against Mr. Pincher, which, to be fair, he was trying to find out whether there was any truth to the allegations. You don't want to just, as soon as the media is talking about something, strike someone off, because they could potentially be innocent, right? They could have not done anything harmful. It could be fake news. But yeah, the move came amid further claims being levelled against Mr. Pincher, as well as an investigation launched against him because there were complaints. So that's actually something a bit more tangible that would be able to get him removed. But to be fair, they gave him the benefit of the doubt to start. But Downing Street claimed that Mr. Johnson was not aware of specific allegations against Mr. Pincher before appointing him Deputy Chief Whip. However, apparently, according to one source, The Prime Minister accordingly quipped, "Pincher by name, pincher by nature." So that makes me think that there's some sort of questionable sexual assault history. Yeah. It seems to me that perhaps he did know, and maybe they were lying. So it seems to me that something shady probably was going on here. So it goes on to say that Mr. Pincher claimed he is now seeking medical support after getting too drunk and embarrassing himself, which, I mean, his actions almost directly led to the collapse of a government. So that's got to be some wild night. I don't know what he got up to. But yes, this basically led to numerous ministers resigning after it emerged that Boris Johnson might have lied about his knowledge of Pincher's background. And this carried on and on and on. So it got to the point where after Boris Johnson had taken office in 2019, a total of 60 government ministers had resigned whilst he was being Prime Minister, which is quite a large number. I mean, it's relatively close to Theresa May, but that's not exactly much praise, is it? I mean, Theresa May wasn't exactly known for doing particularly much. So moving on and on, ministers continue to resign. He got lambasted in the Commons, particularly by people like Sajid Javid, who had since resigned and then said it was unacceptable what he was doing, saying, "You should resign." So when his own former sort of inner circle of ministers had turned on him, he was seen that, okay, well, there aren't that many people loyal to me anymore, I must resign. So eventually, on the 7th of July, the BBC reported that Boris Johnson is resigning as Conservative Party leader and addressed the country at midday yesterday, confirming that he would step down as Prime Minister, stating, I'm quoting here, he was immensely proud of achievements of his government, from getting Brexit done to putting the UK through the pandemic and leading the West in standing up to Putin's aggression in Ukraine.
The usual babble.
Yes,
I
exactly.
mean, this is what I mean by when I said that the internal nonsense of Westminster is not what people are going to remember or care about. I mean, the events that led up to this specific instance of him resigning is not really what killed Boris Johnson. I mean, what killed Boris Johnson was the lockdowns, as Starkey said this morning. I mean, that's the thing that changed him from the Brexit man with Dominic Cummings into this weird figure who locked down the whole country, essentially telling everyone that the state was God and has a right to tell you what to do, and then got caught in his own trap by having those parties. I mean, like, Nigel Farage was correct when he said that's the beginning of the end of Boris Johnson. Because it's, okay, he's thrown his entire worldview, instead of with, your ideological friends who got you where you are, instead with this idea that the state should be God through locking down the country. And then even that, you messed up. You couldn't even be consistent on that.
Yeah, and I do agree with that. And I'm also going to get onto, in a second, an article from the Washington Examiner before I go into this article. This is actually a video from Carl, sorry. Boris was elected as a radical, and it's talking about how Boris Johnson's promises when he was elected very much differed from how he's actually behaved, and how this is kind of a betrayal of, people who are actually conservative, because he certainly hasn't behaved like one. He hasn't capitalised on Brexit. He hasn't repealed the legacy of Tony Blair, but I'll get onto all the things he's done wrong. I'm certainly not going to give him an easy time, but let's move on to this article by Daniel Hannan first, who's one of my favourite people in Parliament, really. He's in the House of Lords. He was known for being quite the Brexiteer, big proponent of the free market and limited government, also criticised the government for the lockdowns, which is why he says the lockdowns was the kind of point, as you say, where people's attitudes changed. This lovable idiot all of a sudden became very abrasive when he's forcing you to stay in your homes, and these sorts of bumbling, foolish jokes, they didn't really land anymore, because people realised that, wow, this is actually really terrible. I'm not willing to humour this anymore.
Well, it's because it's not so much he just abandoned his bumbling jokes so they weren't landing. It's because there's a complete tonal shift between Boris Johnson, the man who's get Brexit done, love the country, North and the South united because, Labour are a bunch of nonce hunters, nonce defenders.
If only.
And no, that whole little shtick had left, because he had then signed up with the idea instead, massively anti-free market, massively anti-libertarian, and said he had become this man who thinks that the left-wing narrative is actually true. We can just spend money endlessly and there'll be no problems. People don't really have to work, do they? We just put them on furlough forever. What's going to be the problem with that? And maybe the state should tell you what you can do in your own homes, or even leave them. I mean, that is a huge difference between what happened.
People really did expect something very different from him, and all he delivered was much of the same of exactly what we've come to expect from politicians, where they're just willing to rule by decree, make our lives objectively worse. And it's kind of unacceptable, isn't it? So moving back to this article by Daniel Hannan, it starts off saying Boris Johnson was brought down three successive prime ministers. First, David Cameron, who he beat in 2016. Then Theresa May, whose cold fingers he pried off of the Downing Street door handles in 2019. Now, Boris Johnson. And what he's trying to say here is that he inflicted this upon himself by his own policy decisions. And basically, I think he does a good job of looking at some of the good that he did, whilst mainly holding him accountable for a lot of the bad he did. And I think that there are some good things he did. He did, for example, get Theresa May out of the driving seat for Brexit, which would have been a disaster. Her negotiations just simply weren't working. Probably didn't help that the person she sent to do the negotiations was an arch Remainer. That kind of seems like a fundamental thing, but never mind. It goes on to say his character flaws did for him. No, what? That doesn't make sense. But anyway, everyone knew Boris's strengths and weaknesses when he was elected. He was sharp, witty, undisciplined, egotistical, generous, licentious, optimistic, unreliable, and incapable of bearing a grudge. The norms that bound the rest of us, however, never applied to him. He seemed like one of Homer's heroes, or perhaps Nietzsche's magnificent blonde beast hungry for plunder and victory. His Wikipedia entry is unclear on how many children he has. He came to office after a string of gaffes and misadventures that would have destroyed another politician, yet he won the greatest majority since Margaret Thatcher's in 1987. At first, his contempt for conviction was just what the country needed. No one else could have broken the deadlock that set in after 2017 when a pro-EU majority in Parliament refused to allow Brexit, but also blocked fresh elections. It was bold, bombastic Boris who beat Corbyn, delivered Brexit, and again, defying all procedures, procured the fastest vaccine rollout in the world. Don't much care about that last part. But as I lamented in these pages at the time, the lockdown altered people's psychology. A mood of grim and prissy self-denial settled on Britain. Boris's jokes began to fall flat. All his life, he had been forgiven for his failings by a nation that saw them as part of a Falstaffian character. Suddenly, the smallest infractions began to enrage voters. And this is...
I kind of hate this rhetoric. The idea that he was once the funny man, and now it's, something's changed, he's not so funny. I can't figure out why.
Well, it's not the humour aspect, it's that people's patience wore thin after what he did.
It's the ideological shift. I mean, you will support Bumbly Funny Man if he's doing the right things. If he's telling Johnny Foreigner to get stuffed, the EU can go screw themselves, and, we're going to be Brexit United. That actually is something you can get behind, no matter how fumbly and bubbly he is. Whereas if he's actively oppressing you, and he's fumbly and bumbly, it's not about the fumbly and bumbly. That's not the thing that's interesting about the change. The change is the ideological steps he took.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So it goes on to say, there is, I suppose, a certain irony in Boris Johnson being brought down by a sex scandal that didn't involve him. But what really did for him was the shift in the national mood. He was to... I'm going to skip over that part. But anyway, he goes on to say that through things like the authoritarian mood ushered in by COVID and his unwillingness to say no led paradoxically to greater unpopularity. So this is exactly the point you're actually making, that he was building up to, is that it was this authoritarian shift that he did that was eventually his downfall, I would say.
Let me do a thing that will alienate my entire base.
Yes.
Politics 101.
And the funny thing is that the herd immunity idea that he was banding around originally, well, it seems that from some of the research post-pandemic, that could have actually been far better as a strategy. But there we go.
The research pre-pandemic was also good for that. But
that's by the by now, unfortunately, and we can't really talk about that on YouTube, can we? I don't think. But yes, let's talk about the good and the bad of Boris Johnson to end this, to kind of ruminate on his questionable legacy. So I suppose one of the good things is that he did see Brexit through to its actual conclusion, which is something. It was a difficult push with a hostile Parliament, as Hannan pointed out. He did also crush Jeremy Corbyn, who was obviously a socialist, with an 80-seat majority. However, it's worth pointing out that he didn't do anything with it. One of the largest majorities, he basically carried on the status quo, didn't he? And I've got a long list of things that you could have reversed of Tony Blair's that would have been bread and butter conservative things that you could have done to make everyone happy. He just ignored. But of course, another potentially good thing, depending on who you ask, is that he did spearhead the European response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and provided the Ukrainians with many weapons to at least give them a fighting chance. But, you know, part of me thinks that, well, that was a lot of British money in the middle of a financial downturn.
And also, actually, compared to what the Americans were giving, it's nothing.
Yes. So I don't know. So there is plenty of bad stuff to go over, and I don't like the guy personally. I think that, sure, he's the best of a bad bunch, but what he did was kind of appalling as a prime minister. So, for example, immigration was never higher, even though he got elected on a promise of reducing immigration. So 2021 saw legal immigration reach 1 million people in the middle of a pandemic. That's a terrible legacy to leave behind, isn't it? That's the antithetical to your own election promises. I mean, you promised to reduce immigration, you made it the highest ever. Not only that, of course, but channel migrants, the illegal migrants, were at their highest levels as well, weren't they? And they didn't really do anything to reduce that. They tried to do the Rwanda plan many years too late, which hasn't really taken off the ground, if you pardon the pun. But there is also, of course, the fact that when he was London mayor, he promised amnesty for all illegal immigrants in London. So where does his heart really lie? Was he just saying stuff to get elected and all he really cared about was power? Because that's probably what I would say is true. I don't think he actually cared about these issues. I think what he cared about was, you know, beating his mate Dave, you know, David Cameron. They went to school together. He got to be prime minister. He wanted to be prime minister. It was more about that. And you see how chipper he was when he was resigning. He was almost pleased. It wasn't like Theresa May where she was crying her eyes out. It was very weird that he was resigning and he couldn't suppress a smile. Like, I don't know. It's all in bad taste to me. Of course, as you suggested...
Well, they had just won the Brexit referendum. He was on the right side of it and was about to become prime minister, everyone thought. So...
What, in his resignation?
No, in David Cameron's resignation.
Oh, right. No, I was on about Boris Johnson smiling and being happy.
Yeah.
No, I don't think David Cameron
Carrie. Oh, you wish.
Yeah, you can palm her off onto the next prime minister. So yes, obviously the lockdowns was a massive disaster. I really don't like how they were handled in Britain. The only consolation really is that they were better than a lot of the continent, but that's very small as a consolation. I mean, I'm pretty miserable about the whole state of the political system that he's left behind as well. So yes, he also held the potential for the introduction of vaccine passports over people's heads to try and coerce people into uptaking the thing before actually U-turning, which is not great. He failed to capitalise on the advantages that Brexit afforded us. We haven't tried to be as competitive as we could. We've signed a few trade deals, but not nearly enough to really warrant, how much of a champion he was of the process. You would think that, okay, he would have this process set in place day one. We're going to organise trade deals with these countries. We can get this sorted. We know what we want, because it wasn't a surprise. We knew what was going to happen, and yet it took so long to sort out. And this is a bit petty, but in his resignation, he thanked the civil service, despite them actively undermining the actions of the government. I believe we've covered this on the podcast before, that when the government banned these woke kinds of training, like unconscious bias training, diversity training, they said, we can't have these in government departments. We had people leaking us information that said that it was going on. And the fact that they're directly insubordinate against him, and then he goes out of his way to thank them in his resignation speech. I mean, what is he thinking?
But it's just dumb.
Yes. And of course, he used the slogan, Build Back Better, the Biden and World Economic Forum associated slogan. So yeah, kind of an indicator of his true allegiance there. And of course, this is probably my main gripe, this next one, is that he had a large majority, one of the largest we've had in many years, but failed to remove the legacy of Tony Blair. So He could have got rid of the Supreme Court, which doesn't fit in with the British Constitution. It doesn't work. It actively undermines Parliament. It's just an avenue for activism. It doesn't belong in Britain. He didn't repeal Section 127 of the Communications Act. There are plenty of hate speech laws. Still, affirmative action is legal. There's still the BBC being left-wing. That hasn't changed. They could have fixed that. They increased NHS funding and encouraged the creepy NHS worship. This, like, oh, praise the NHS, aren't they great? When, I mean, sure, the people on the front lines are probably working hard, but praising the institution that we pay taxes for, a lot of money for, that's just weird. It's weird state worship.
But that's exactly my point. The change in ideology from, we're going to save money, cut spending, actually get rid of the government debt, to let's just praise the holy NHS. That is what we live for, right, comrades?
I would go so far as to say he didn't really believe in much other than naked power. He just wanted to be the man in the chair.
Well, that's the problem with Tories. I mean, whenever you act out, you talk to them, too often you get the phrase, which is, oh, I don't believe in ideology, I just believe in what works. The hell does that mean? What works can be defined by anyone to mean anything, depending on your ideology, funnily enough.
Well, ideology is your preconception that you go to look at what works. You can't not have ideology. It's impossible to escape it.
But also, what man are you? Like, why did you join a ideological party if you were then just going to be a man in a suit? And that's what you get.
That is what we had, yeah. Another egregious thing is, shortly before he left, he accused Putin of toxic masculinity. Very embarrassing for Britain. We've got this spineless man who's ruled over by his wife, accusing Putin of toxic masculinity. Surely that just serves to make Putin look better to his own country. Just like, oh, you're toxically masculine, whereas I'm under the thumb of my wife. I mean, come on. Yeah. He also said it's okay to be woke. And he also launched a green investment scheme with Bill Gates, and was mad on all of that eco stuff, talking about net zero and all of these sort of climate conspiracies that don't actually have any reasoned evidence behind them. And I mean, what's your overall feeling of Boris Johnson being gone?
Oh, I don't care.
No?
This is why yesterday I said I don't care, because I'm not interested in the man himself, because the difference between today and 5 days ago is what? Nothing, really. Like, yeah, he's gone, but then what's interesting is who's going next and what's the lineup look like. Because so far it seems to be the main front runners, as the betting shops are picking, are just the same thing. And
they're all of the senior members of Boris Johnson's cabinet, aren't they? So they're Boris adjacent.
But really. It's not so much about that. It's the type of people. I mean, the fact that they are ideologically just vapid. There's nothing there. There is nothing that actually will have them nail their colours to the mast and say, no, we're not going to do lockdowns, or no, we're not going to do what the Labour Party says just because they've said it. Instead, because I actually believe something, we shan't do that. And then you could have your base, as literally gave you an 80-seat majority, clap along and say, well, thank you for doing the right thing for once. And instead, it looks like we're not going to get that. So that's why I'm so vapid about it.
The fact that he won such a large majority and he's already gone before his term's up might serve as a lesson that actually you need to stick by your principles, otherwise people are going to get rid of you. But I doubt that's going to happen.
They won't learn that lesson. They'll learn the lesson that, don't get caught in a Westminster scandal, the media drum up. It's like, it's not a lesson to learn, nothing. But that's the thing they'll learn from it. Yeah,
so not really much positive to say, because we're not going to get anyone better. We've maybe got a chance of getting someone worse.
At least the front runners I've seen. I thought we were going to the other aspects, but I don't know who's thrown the hat in the ring yet. So.
I think one of the bookies' favourites is Rishi Sunak, because he's one of the few senior Tories at the minute that seems to be able to beat Keir Starmer in polling.
Yeah, I mean, just empty suit man.
Yeah, but I always find that with these sorts of races, it's always very difficult from the outset, before everyone's even thrown their hat in the ring, to predict where things are going to go. I mean, look at 2016 in America. No one would have guessed that Donald Trump would have been the Republican candidate, and yet he was. But
you could have guessed that Donald Trump would be on your side.
Oh, yeah. But I don't see there being anyone on our side in this prime ministerial competition. Sorry to end on a depressing note, but that's where I'm probably going to have to lead it. I think that Britain hasn't got a bright future ahead of it as far as I'm concerned.
If you enjoyed that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as the Epoch series, this one being on the Anglo-Saxons with Carl and Bo. If you want to find out what else we're putting out, you can follow us on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.